Ok, buenos días, buenas tardes a todos. Aquí María Martí, presidente del Ayn Rand Center para América Latina. Ya desde Buenos Aires, después de una larga espera para volver al país desde Estados Unidos, he logrado volver aquí a la Argentina. Así que queremos presentarles el quinto webinario de la serie del Ayn Rand Center para Latinoamérica y agradecerle especialmente la presencia a Ben Bayer, que es Fellow e instructor del Ayn Rand Institute. As you know, Ben, hello, thank you very much for being here with all of us. I think the topic that you're going to talk today is a very important for Latin America, since you know that we have a very big influence of Christianity and Catholicism. So I think our morality is, how do you say, impregnated, I don't know the word, with this idea of original sin. So I think it's a very important topic to talk about. So thank you very much for being willing to talk. It's going to be a difficult topic probably because I think 80% or 90% of Latin Americans are very religious people. But for that reason, I think it's a very good idea to talk and to have a conversation and arguments if needed about this topic. So thank you very much. And you have 30, 40 minutes to talk about whatever you want, and then we will have a period of Q&A. And I already have like 10 questions for you. So be prepared for that. And thank you for all the audience, and let's welcome Ben Bayer.
Thank you, Maria, and thanks for having me. And I wish we'd be able to come down and visit you all in person this summer. I know that's less likely these days to happen because of the state of the world, so it's all the better that we can do these virtual talks, I think. So I'm going to be using some slides of my own, and I'm going to be alternating back and forth between my screen, between the video image of me and the slides. So I hope not to keep the slides up for too long. But here's the first one. The title of the talk is A Mockery of Morality, the Doctrine of Original Sin. And what I said in the brief description for this talk today was that I was going to talk, first of all, about what this doctrine is, where it comes from, and what Ayn Rand's philosophy has to say about it, why she regards it as a mockery of morality. That's, in fact, her own description of it that's taken from a line from a speech in her novel Atlas Shrugged. And I think there's several levels on which that title, that description can be appreciated, and she certainly has many things to say against this doctrine, which is nonetheless a widespread and popular doctrine in the West, both in Europe, North America, and South America. So I want to actually start by giving a couple of examples of what I think are revealing places where this doctrine is sometimes invoked. As I think you all know, in the Catholic Church, in all of the Americas and in Europe, there has been a sexual abuse crisis over the last number of decades. And I have two examples drawn from this crisis that where the topic of original sin comes up. The first of these is from someone named Cardinal George Pell. Maybe you've heard of him because he was a cardinal in Australia who was recently brought up on charges that he covered up the sex abuse crisis in Australia. And they did he did testimony before the Australian Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Sexual Abuse. One of the interrogators asked him this question. They asked, "Can you help us, Cardinal, with why you think it is that the Catholic Church has operated in such a similar way across many different countries in the world?" And that's true, it has. Why has there been this abuse in so many countries? Why has it been covered up? His answer is, unfortunately, original sin is alive and well. The tendency to evil is in the Catholic Church too. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse, but for good or ill, the Church follows the patterns of societies in which it lives. So that's one invocation of the doctrine of original sin. And I'm going to come back to analyze that example at the end of the talk today. But here's just for rounding it out completely, here's one more. This is from an article written in a major Catholic newspaper in the United States, the National Catholic Reporter, also reflecting on the same sexual abuse crisis. The author here is someone named Michael Sean Winters. I don't know too much about this particular author, but I found his analysis of the abuse scandal to be also particularly interesting. He says, "Before we throw stones at the Vatican or your local bishop, think about the many ways you, dear reader, have left the path of self-accusation and become a source of affliction to yourself and others. Of course, covering up sex abuse or being negligent in protecting children is a grave sin, but its roots are in the same soil of original sin from which sprout all of our sinful thoughts and words and deeds done and not done. It should surprise none of us, but especially a bishop, that all of us are in need of a savior." So part of what he's doing in this article is he's looking at the different criticisms that the church is getting because of this sexual abuse crisis. And he's, to some extent, acknowledging these criticisms, just like Cardinal Pell did. But he's going a little further even than Cardinal Pell did, and he's saying, who among you is going to cast the first stone? Who among you is without sin that you can criticize the church for being so sinful? I think these are both very revealing and meaningful invocations of the doctrine of original sin. And like I said, I want to come back to them later to say more about, I think, what they reveal about this doctrine. But before I do that, we need to answer some really basic questions. We need to talk about what this doctrine is, and we need to try to evaluate it, especially in light of the reasons that people have, if you want to call it that, for believing in this viewpoint in the first place. So to just start out by giving a simple definition, and this is a very simple definition. You could give, I'm sure, more complicated ones in different doctrines. Different theologians have different ways of putting it, but to boil it down to its essence, I think what it comes down to is the idea that all human beings are sinful by nature. And so keep in mind here that when people rely on the doctrine of original sin, they're not, I mean, part of what they're saying is that we're all sinners, but they're also not simply saying that we all just happen to be sinners because we all happened to make bad choices. They're saying that it's in our nature to sin, that we're all inherently, innately sinful, that we're born bad in some important way, that it was transmitted to us by our ancestors that we have this sinful nature. And of course, this is a doctrine that's most closely associated with Christianity. You don't necessarily find it in every you don't find it in every Judeo-Christian religion. I don't think you find it in Judaism. And you don't even necessarily find it in all Christian sects. It's not in Eastern Christianity. It's not in all Western sects either. We could talk more about that if anyone is interested. In Western Christianity, at least, it's usually connected with the creation story, with Adam and Eve, and its original sin is supposed to have been transmitted to us by the first sin of Adam. But it's also important to note that there are not every religious, not every even Christian sect interprets the Adam and Eve story that way. That's part of why it's only a certain number of Christian sects that do. And even those who at one point interpreted it that way haven't always retained the interpretation. So the Catholic Church, for instance, the official idea is that the Adam and Eve story is a myth, that this didn't literally happen. But they maintain the doctrine of original sin anyway. So they have more intellectually sophisticated reasons for regarding the doctrine as true. They say that regardless of what you think of creation, even if you don't believe in Adam and Eve, there's still this nature that we all possess. Sometimes they call it concupiscence, which is our lustful nature. which is just inherent in who we are and passed down to us from our ancestors. And you don't have to believe in Adam and Eve to think that. So the reasons that people have for believing that we have that nature are, I think, many and complex and interesting, and I want to talk about them still. But before I even delve into the potential reasons that people could give, or the justifications that they could give for thinking something like this is true, I want to just right away say what is strange about this doctrine on the face of it. And to get that conversation started, I want to share with you what Ayn Rand said about this doctrine. This is taken from Atlas Shrugged. This is from a speech of one of the major characters in Atlas Shrugged, and I'll show you two passages, one that comes right after the other. She says, a sin, and I'm gonna unpack this quotation and try to explain more of it as we go. She says, a sin without volition is a slap at morality and an insolent contradiction in terms. That which is outside the possibility of choice is outside the province of morality. If man is evil by birth, he has no will, no power to change it. If he has no will, he can be neither good nor evil. A robot is amoral. To hold as man's sin, a fact not open to his choice, is a mockery of morality. So that's where I get the title of the talk from. And she goes on a little further. I'll just give you one last bit. She says, to hold man's nature as the sin is a mockery of nature. To punish him for a crime he committed before he was born is a mockery of justice. To hold him guilty in a matter where no innocence exists is a mockery of reason. To destroy morality, nature, justice, and reason by means of a single concept is a feat of evil, hardly to be matched, yet that is the root of your code. So she's not just saying the doctrine is strange, she's saying the doctrine of original sin is irrational and evil. And yet this is one of the most popular, widely accepted doctrines in the Western world. So why does she think it's so evil? What does she think is so wrong with it? Well, I'll share with you some of the initial reasons for objecting to it, the problems that make this an irrational doctrine. So we begin to unpack what the implications of these problems are. We'll, I think, start to see why she thinks it's evil. So the first thing to say, and this is something that was referenced in the quotation that I shared, is that original sin is allegedly a sin that you didn't choose. It's a sin that was somehow inherited from your ancestors. Maybe it's a sin that they chose, but it's certainly not one that you chose, and yet you become sinful in some important sense because of it. And so the first reason I think that Ayn Rand gives for rejecting this view is that it denies that we have free will. It attributes to us some kind of vicious character because of something that we didn't do, or it says that we do something that we can't help but do, which is itself evil. Now, it's worth saying a fair amount about why it is that original sin implies this, because I think a lot of people who think of themselves as Christians who believe the doctrine of original sin don't think of themselves as people who reject free will. Now, that's not the case for all of them. There are some sects of Christianity where the connection between original sin and the denial of free will is particularly obvious. This is most obvious when you look at certain viewpoints in the Lutheran and especially in the Calvinist Protestant traditions where the idea of free will is explicitly denied. And I think that the logic that the Lutherans and the Calvinists give for this is pretty clear. And it goes a little something like this. They will say, look, all good things come from God. God is supposed to be all-powerful, all-knowing, all good. And so if you thought that your own virtue, your own salvation is something that you were responsible for, well, that would mean there would be one good thing that wasn't coming from God. But that would contradict the original assumption that all good things come from God. So it can't be the case that you all by yourself can do good. All you can do by yourself is evil. You therefore don't have any power to determine your own virtue or your own salvation, if that's thought to be connected to virtue. And that means directly that you don't have any free will. This is the line of argument that Luther gives. This is the line of argument that Calvin gives. And it's a pretty straightforward kind of deduction that you can make from a certain number of premises about how God is supposed to be the source of all good things and knows everything and has all the power in the world. If you had the power to save yourself from hellfire, then that would mean there's a power of goodness that God doesn't have. Now, it's true that in other Western Christian traditions, it's not as obvious that there's a denial of free will that goes along with the doctrine of original sin. And Catholics in particular claim to believe in both original sin and free will. But it's worth saying a few words about why, even though that's what the official stance is, it is an incredibly difficult stance to maintain, and why when you scratch the surface of it, you find that you can't have both. So the whole doctrine of original sin really comes from St. Augustine, when he was a church father in the 5th century AD, when he was a bishop, when he was, in particular, when he was combating certain heresies. So there was a heresy that emerged in this period called the Pelagian heresy. Well, they called it the heresy after Augustine critiqued it, but it was called Pelagianism, led by a fellow named Pelagius. And their view was a rejection of original sin. They said, no, human beings are perfectible because we have free will, because we're made in the image of God. And therefore, it's not even the case that Christ is the only perfect man. He's just a really good role model in their view. But Augustine saw this view as heretical because it contradicted all the different assumptions that we mentioned before, God's being the source of all good and all power in the universe. And so just to underscore how even the Catholic Church, which to this day endorses Augustine's teachings on these matters, has a hard time maintaining a belief in free will in the face of its acceptance of original sin, I think it's worth spending just a moment to look at some of the things Augustine said about this, to get clear really on what the stakes are here. So I mentioned that he in particular formulated his doctrine of original sin, especially in contrast to this Pelagian view. So if you look at the writings that he made against the Pelagians, you'll see him saying things like this against Pelagius and his followers. He said, "These and similar testimonies of Holy Scripture in maintenance of free will leave no room for God's assistance and grace in leading a godly life and a good conversation, to which the eternal reward is due. And lest poor wretched man, when he leads a good life and performs good works, or rather thinks he leads a good life and performs good works, should dare to glory in himself and not in the Lord, and to put his hope in righteous living in himself alone." So part of what Augustine is saying there is that if you think you have the power to create your own goodness and your own salvation, you believe in a kind of free will which would take God's power away from him, and it would be a kind of sinful pride, glorying in yourself to think that you had that power. Now, you might still say, okay, well, so Augustine doesn't think you have that kind of free will. Maybe he thinks you have some other kind of free will. But let's look at one more thing that he says. In a different part of that same letter against the Pelagians, he says this: "Not only men's good wills, which God himself converts from bad ones, and which, converted by him, directs to good action and to eternal life, but also those which follow the world are so entirely at the disposal of God that he turns them wherever he wills and whenever he wills to bestow kindness on some and to heap punishment on others, as he himself judges right by a counsel most secret to himself. Indeed, but beyond all doubt, most righteous. God works in the hearts of men to incline their wills wherever he wills, whether to good deeds according to his mercy or to evil after their own deserts. And so the example that I always like to give to try to illustrate what I think he's saying here is if you think of the story from the Old Testament about Pharaoh and the Hebrews. So Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, "Let my people go." And there are several times in Exodus a description that the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart. And so he does not let his people go. So the way that the scripture sounds there is that God is making Pharaoh choose to do the evil thing of not letting the Hebrew slaves go. And then as a result, God punishes Pharaoh with all the different plagues, but for the thing that God made Pharaoh want to do. And certainly what Augustine is saying here is that people like Moses, let's say, who try to free the slaves, they are only given that will because God's grace makes it possible. It's not any will of Moses's that makes that happen. It's all because of God. And you might wonder, how does this seem fair? How does this seem just? That the Almighty would punish people for basically the things that he makes them do. Well, Augustine has some sense that there's something off about that. So in other passages that I won't quote, he does still argue for a kind of free will, but the way that he defines the free will makes it clear that it's not the kind of free will you ordinarily think about if you think that we have a choice between one and another option. He defines free will as basically the ability to do what you want unimpeded by external obstacles. So if you want to enslave the Hebrews and you're not in chains, then you're free in what you're doing. But of course, the reason that you wanted to enslave the Hebrews in the first place was because God made you want to. This is a view that's called compatibilism by philosophers today. And yeah, it preserves the language of freedom. And so Augustine's able to say, yeah, well, Pharaoh's free because he's not locked up, he's not being pushed around, he's doing what he wants, but it's consistent with Pharaoh's doing what he wants only because God made him want it. It's not the kind of freedom that involves pursuing one path or another in life and being able to choose equally between the two of those, or even being able to evaluate one's own desires and want one thing or another. And that's something that Augustine especially feels the need to insist on if he wants to preserve God's divine foreknowledge. Because remember, God's supposed to know everything. That means he's supposed to know everything that everybody does ever in the past and the future. And if someone could choose one thing or another, God wouldn't know which it was, and it wouldn't be up to God, but all things are supposed to be up to God. And one last little historical comment before I go back into why people believe this. In case anybody is thinking, well, that's what Augustine says in the 4th, 5th century. Surely the church today has a more enlightened view. Well, if you look at the Catholic Catechism, which was sponsored by Pope John Paul II and then basically executed by Pope Benedict before he was Pope Benedict, it's Joseph Ratzinger. Here's passage, section 1993. Says, when God touches man's heart through the illumination of the Holy Spirit, man himself is not inactive while receiving that inspiration, since he could reject it, and yet, without God's grace, he cannot by his own free will move himself toward justice in God's sight. So you see, it's really trying to do two things here. It's trying to say, well, you have free will because you could reject the grace, but you still don't have the free will choice to actually do the good things that would put you in grace, that would save your soul, that would make you a good person. So there's an incredible tension in what the church is trying what the Catholic Church is trying to argue for here. And now there are a lot of other views in Western Christianity that still try to reconcile original sin and free will, or the various attributes of God with free will. And I'm not a historian of Christian religion. I can't go into all the different variations. That would be a long conversation. But what I can tell you is that from what I've surveyed so far, if they try really hard to reconcile all these views, they end up doing one or another thing. They end up either denying one of the cherished attributes of God, such as his all-powerful nature, his omnibenevolence, that is the idea that all good things come from him, or they deny his foreknowledge. They either do that, or they have to water down free will and say, well, you have free will, but it's only in a weakened sense that doesn't involve actually being able to choose one way or the other in your life. So the first reason that I gave for why Ayn Rand rejects original sin is that it denies free will. But of course, that's only a problem for this view if we actually have free will. and she thinks that we do. And I think a lot of people think that we do. And you can observe this on several different levels. And so I'll just give a simple example. Take a relatively uncontroversial example of an immoral action that you could choose. Suppose you are in a situation where you could cheat on your husband or your wife. You meet some person who tempts you. You may even feel a very strong temptation. Well, don't you think that you have the power to act on that temptation or not? That you can either give into it, or you can resist it, or find some better way to deal with your time. And it goes deeper than that. Importantly, it goes deeper than that. It's not just a freedom that you have to act on the temptation or not. It's a freedom that's more internal than that. It's a freedom to reflect on the very source of the temptation, to think about, well, why are you so tempted by this thing? What psychological premises are at work in making you so tempted? And you can even work on challenging those premises and maybe even eliminating them in a way that leads you to not be tempted like this again in the future. So in Ayn Rand's view, at least, and there's a lot more that we could say about this, it's a whole other talk. So if people want to ask questions about it, that's a good thing to ask questions about. What free will is fundamentally is your power to think or not to think. Your power to look at the world around you and to try to process it. And that includes looking at the emotions that you're feeling about a certain kind of situation and thinking about what the right action in the world would be in response to those emotions. And she thought that the extent to which you turn your mind on or off, that's the extent to which you go on to determine your own beliefs about the world, your feelings about the world, what you're going to do about them. And this all adds up to an overall character that you are in control of. She thought you have, because of all of this, what she called a self-made soul. And like I said, there's a lot of other things that we could say about this. But obviously, if she thinks we do have free will, and there's good historical reason to think that the doctrine of original sin denies free will, well, that's definitely a mark against the doctrine of original sin. There's one more basic point about what original sin says that she finds particularly illogical, that I want to point to. And that's the point that morality doesn't apply to unchosen things. So someone could say, okay, we don't have free will, fine. That is entailed by original sin. But maybe they disagree with her that we have free will, and they give arguments against free will. Well, even still, there's a question of why call it original sin? How does morality even apply to a choice that is not really chosen? How can you call it a sin, which is, of course, supposed to be an infraction of morality? So in the passage from Ayn Rand that I read before, the way she put this point was to say that which is outside the possibility of choice is outside the province of morality. And she also made the point that a robot that was just programmed to do what it does, that didn't have any choice in the matter because it was completely deterministic, wouldn't be an entity that you could judge morally. It would be an amoral entity, just like a fact of nature. And I think there are many deep reasons that one can give for thinking that morality presupposes free will in this sense. I mean, the most important reason, which is one that she stresses in her own work on ethics, is that the whole reason that we need morality in the first place, the whole reason that we need moral concepts like right and wrong, concepts like what you ought to do and what you ought not to do, is because we have choices that are in need of guidance. We are volitional beings who are not automatic, who don't automatically know what to do, who don't automatically have the knowledge that we need to live, and who need to formulate codes of action, principles to guide our choices if we want to figure out what to do and what kind of person we want to become. So to go back to that kind of forking path imagery that I keep using, at any point in life, we can go in several directions. And part of the reason that we need morality is when we get to those points in life where it makes a big difference which way we're going to go, where it has a fundamental effect on our life, we need to know what's the right thing to do. And if we don't face this choice, what do we need to talk about morality for at all? And there's more that I could say about this, but I think that's the basic idea. And so this then leads into a conversation of where does this doctrine of original sin even come from in the first place? Why, in spite of the pretty clear logical problems with the doctrine, do people find it appealing? Why do they find it, why is it so widespread? What are the roots of original sin? Well, I think if you ask most people, what they're going to reference is the Bible story. They're going to talk about Adam and Eve and how Adam made a choice, a sinful choice to eat the apple, and somehow that's come down to the rest of us. But as I mentioned before, this is, I don't think, the main reason why people believe in original sin. I mean, for one thing, not all religions interpret the Adam and Eve story in the same way, even when it's part of their religious text. Judaism has this in its Old Testament. Judaism doesn't believe in original sin. There's a lot of Christian doctrines that don't believe it, and there are even Christian doctrines like Catholicism that don't believe the literal truth of the Adam and Eve story, and yet they accept original sin anyway. The most that I think you could say, or the biggest point to make about those people who do believe in it because of the Bible story, the question to then ask is, well, why do they believe the literal truth of the Bible story, and why do they believe the interpretation that's been assigned to it? I mean, one point that's been made is that there are contradictory parts of that story. You know, one of them says that God made Adam and Eve in his image and what he saw was good. And then there's a totally different part of the story where the sin happens. So which part do you pick? There's more contradictions than that. I won't go into it now. But even leaving that aside, why believe that something like this happened? Why think that that bad choice would somehow transmit itself to the rest of us? And you know, why think that this ancient Bible story, which has been translated 1 million times over and has these contradictions, is something that anybody should believe, especially given the problems with the doctrine of original sin that we've just talked about before. I think this is part of why Ayn Rand said that to hold him guilty in a manner where no innocence exists is a mockery of reason, because you're expected here to take this story on faith. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't really have any facts to back it up. even if you accept the literal truth of the story, which there's not really good reason to accept. So anyone who believes this just because of the Bible is taking it on faith, and that's part of why she thinks it's a mockery of reason. But let's talk about the more sophisticated versions of the view that don't depend on the Bible story. It's important here, I think, that Augustine, who we've talked about previously, is one of the main people who formulated this doctrine. And he did it heavily under the influence of not just a certain reading of scripture, but the philosophical thinking of his day, especially the Neoplatonic philosophy that he had been schooled in, that was very popular in his part of the Mediterranean. And you see in the doctrine of original sin echoes of many key Platonic and Neoplatonic ideas. You see the idea that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. That's a kind of popular way of putting it, but in Plato, it comes from the fact that Plato thinks that our spirit or our mind or our nous puts us in touch with a higher, unchanging, perfect dimension, whereas the body, as opposed to the spirit, it's the source of change, of decay, of corruption, of imperfection. And so in this Platonic philosophy, the body is seen as the root of evil. It's seen as the root of corruption. It's the idea that precedes Christianity. It comes from Platonic philosophies and others like it, that nobody's perfect in this world. Nobody ever could be perfect, not so long as they have a body which is corrupt and decaying, and which doesn't participate in the higher world of the perfect form of the good. I should mention this just as an aside. I think the philosophic source of this doctrine, the fact that it doesn't necessarily come in any essential way from reading some Bible story, is a big part of the reason why it's a big part of the reason why there are versions of original sin that you see outside of religion entirely. There are secular versions of original sin. So Freud, for example, is a really good example. Someone he's an atheist, but he also thinks, because we're all ruled by our ids, and our id is kind of like the unwilling part of the body that wants to tear us away from higher things. Environmentalism has an interesting version of original sin. We all, in order to live on this planet, have to breathe, and we have to alter our environment around us. And as long as we are trying to have some kind of material sustenance, we're always going to be sinning just by the very fact of our nature. And yet a lot of these environmentalists are not in any way Christian in their religious orientation. And there's other versions of that we could talk about too. And I think there's this common idea that just the fact of existing makes you imperfect and imperfectible, and at war with the people around you or the environment around you. It comes from a philosophic inheritance that's prior to Christianity, that's prior to any kind of Bible story. And so that's one of the deeper roots, this philosophic perspective. But I would be incredibly remiss if I didn't mention one other important philosophic perspective that I think really empowers the idea of original sin. It's an idea that is also associated with Christianity, but Christianity by no means has any monopoly on this idea. The idea that morality consists in self-sacrifice. And now, in part, this morality gets empowered by the previous idea that I mentioned, by the soul-body split, by the idea that the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. And so if the body is evil, then, and especially if it's detached from the mind, there's a virtue in giving up what serves that evil body and what serves your life. Of course, Christianity says even more than just that. It says, give up the things for your body, give up the things for your life, whether it's food or riches or sex, or even knowledge of the world. not because it's a source of frustration or of unhappiness, but because God commands it, and for reasons we don't understand. And that's, of course, the ideal that's embodied in the Sermon on the Mount, embodied in the crucifixion. And when you think that that's what the ideal is, it's impossible to practice it consistently. And so, I mean, you can't, as long as you have any desire left in the world, you can't eliminate every allegedly evil desire. You can't live without fulfilling some of those desires. And so as long as you're alive, this view would hold that you are imperfect. This view would hold that you are in some way sinful. So the best that we can do is live a compromised life. We can be moral some of the time, but we have to give in to our evil lusts at other times. And that's why moral imperfection is impossible, and nobody is imperfect in this world. So those are the reasons people believe this. I think I've already been hinting, and some of what I said before about Ayn Rand's views explained more about why she didn't think these were good reasons. I mean, she thinks it's bad to sacrifice your reason and believe a Bible story that has no basis in fact. She's a critic of this soul-body dichotomy. We could say more about that. It has a lot to do with her positive view of reason, that reason has the ability to know the world and therefore the ability to improve it, and that it's not detached from the body. It's what is our basic way of guiding our body through the world. And of course, she's also a critic of, this is what she's probably best known for, she's a critic of the morality of self-sacrifice. She thinks there's no earthly reason to believe that the good consists in giving things up in life, especially if you reject that soul-body split. And if you reject giving up your mind and accepting the morality of self-sacrifice on faith, and you don't know what reason anyone would give you for sacrificing yourself, then you would say, no, what morality is for, as we discussed before, is giving you a set of principles to guide yourself through this life on earth in pursuit of your own happiness in your own life. So given that there aren't good reasons for believing this view, at least in Ayn Rand's perspective, what does it accomplish? What are the effects of this view? And I'll mention three things briefly, and then I'll wrap up and we'll take some questions. Some people observe, well, as long as the church maintains this belief in original sin, it can control people by saying, well, you've got to come to us for salvation. That way, you have to bring the babies to us to get baptized. And I think there might be something to that, but it's a pretty superficial point, because this wouldn't work if people didn't believe the doctrine. And so the bigger question is, why do people believe it? Why does it appeal to them, psychologically speaking, if not because of any sort of logic? And here I think one of the big factors is that it allows people to rationalize immorality. We saw this in the statements of George Pell, saying, hey, you can't blame us more than anybody else for the fact that we covered up the sex abuse crisis. We priests in the church are just as subject to original sin as anybody else. And don't blame us for being perverts, and don't blame us for not stopping the perverts. We couldn't help it. We're all sinners. In other ways, the doctrines also allowed people to rationalize forms of evil because they see that other people are ruled by original sin, and that justifies tyrannizing over them and enslaving them. But the last point I'll mention, the last big thing that is the big function of this doctrine, is to exercise power over people in an even deeper way, not by rationalizing the evil that the power wielders undertake, but by undercutting the self-esteem of everybody else. If you take morality seriously, and if you're led to believe in original sin, you're going to feel guilty about your own desires. I mean, think about your sexual desires. Everybody has them. To the extent that we have them according to original sin, we're guilty. Ayn Rand thought this was the primary reason for church opposition to birth control and abortion. It wasn't that the church wanted people to just reproduce a lot and create more Catholics. It's that they wanted them to see sex as a mere means to God's will, not to their own happiness. It's an interesting question, I think, of how much guilt about sex has caused repression, and which then explains some of the kind of perversion that you've seen in the church with the sexual abuse crisis. And I think you saw this perspective coming out also in that Winters quote, where it's not just that he's saying, don't blame me. He's also using it in order to make other people feel guilty for not only having desires of their own, but for asking questions about the church. Because you can be guilty on this view even for simply asking about why we should believe in original sin, asking why it makes sense. What are the reasons for it? And there I think it's really important, the symbolism of the creation story with Adam and Eve, because what is it that's supposed to be the original sin in that reading? It's supposed to be eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The first sin is supposed to be man's attempt to understand for himself what's good and evil. And of course, original sin regards that as one of the greatest sins. It's intellectual pride, the idea that you can figure out what's good and evil on your own and then practice it on your own. That's why pride is regarded as a sin. And so I'll just close quickly here with a quotation from Ayn Rand, which I think is a good summary of her alternative to this view. If you understand what's wrong with it, if you understand why it has these contradictions and there's no good basis for it, here's what she offers you instead. She says, observe the persistence in mankind's mythologies of the legend about a paradise that men had once possessed, the city of Atlantis or the Garden of Eden or some kingdom of perfection, always behind us. The root of that legend exists, not in the past of the race, but in the past of every man. You still retain a sense that somewhere in the starting years of your childhood, before you had learned to submit, to absorb the terror of unreason and to doubt the value of your mind, you had known a radiant state of existence. You had known the independence of a rational consciousness facing an open universe. That is the paradise which you have lost, which you seek, which is yours for the taking. Okay, so that's all I've got. I can share later some resources if people want to ask about that, but now is, I think, a good time for questions. Sorry, I went a little too long there, Maria.
Can you hear me well? Yes.
I do, but there's an echo.
Yes, because I have Fermin next to me.
One of you needs to mute. The original sin of Zoom broadcasting is not muting when you need to. Now, Maria, you are muted. And now I can't hear you. You muted your mic. I still can't hear you, Maria. Your mic is muted.
Now? Yes.
Yes, and no echo. Great.
Okay, you took me to my years of school. I remember that I had a professor that was always telling me that only if I have faith, I will be saved. And following to that, he said to me, well, but it's God who chooses who are going to have faith. So it seems that I was condemned because I don't have faith, but because God didn't choose me to have faith. So it was a kind of vicious circle that
yeah, I think
I didn't have an escape from it.
I think you made exactly the right response. That is the problem with that response of theirs.
Yeah. Okay, Ben, thank you very much for your presentation. We have several questions here, but I'm going to take advantage to be the host here and do the first one. Mm-hmm. And it's about Thomas Aquinas. I think Thomas Aquinas had a different idea on original sin compared to Augustine. And he said something like, the stain of sin does not impose a nature on the soul, but only the privation of grace. In other words, evil within people exists in the same way that blindness exists as the absence of sight, rather than as an active force or substance in its own right. So my question is, do you think that this different approach to human nature, that we are not bad, but we only suffer from privation of grace, made any difference on or change in any way the conception of morality?
So I'm not a scholar of either Aquinas or Augustine, so this is my answer here is based on the moderate amount that I know about their views. The first thing is that Augustine says something very similar about the nature of evil, that it's not a real presence in someone, it's a privation. And that's something that he gets and I suspect that Aquinas also gets from the Neoplatonists. That was Plotinus's whole idea, that reality is the emanation from the good and into the nothingness of non-existence, and that's where evil is supposed to come from. I don't think it solves any of the problems that I've discussed. What it's there for is to solve the problem of how God could have brought evil into the world, because if evil isn't a something, you can't bring it into the world. If it's just a nothing, then it doesn't require any explanation of its own. So that solves that problem for them, but it still doesn't solve the question of how people could have free will, because the only way, still in Aquinas's view, that you can overcome the nothingness of sin is through God's grace. You still have to have the emanation from the one there, to use Plotinus's language. I mean, there are things about Aquinas that improved the views that he had about morality. I don't think it had anything to do with that particular view of his. I mean, he was influenced by Aristotle in a number of different ways, and notably, Aquinas had the view, sometimes called the erring reason binds. There's a place in the Summa Theologica where he says that if your mind has convinced you that something is right, even if it isn't, then the virtuous thing to do is to go with what your mind tells you to do. And that was a very unique view of Aquinas's, that it's hard to see couldn't have been influenced by Aristotle. And it had some real, I think, significance probably for later, well, here I'm guessing, but I would guess that it would have had some significance for views about toleration, though not ones that Aquinas himself would have practiced, because he thought that atheists should still be executed. So it's not a lot of help. There's other things, I think, in the culture that would have eroded original sin, and we could talk about those too if someone wants to ask about them.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Well, we have a question here from Ricardo. He asked, could you comment on modern and non-religious forms of the idea of original sin? For example, the environmentalist idea that we all pollute through our consumption of goods, and thus we must all repent in the form of carbon tax or something similar.
Yeah, I don't have too much to say about that besides the very little that I already said in the talk, but I do think that there's a real and interesting parallel there, and it has a similar kind of root. So I mentioned the parallel in my talk, but the root of it is probably something along the lines that there's a kind of soul-body dichotomy at work in environmentalism as well, because man is regarded as a kind of aberration. Man is regarded as somehow outside of nature, and because of that, we have a lower nature that is at odds with pristine nature. Now it's very different from the Platonist version, because of course in environmentalism, nature is a material thing that is somehow perfect in its own right, untouched by us. So it's kind of like Plato's forms brought down to earth in a certain way, but nevertheless we still end up being the ones with the grubby lower nature, which are at odds with the rest of the universe. And because we try to figure things out, and because we have intellectual pride, we create technology that alters the earth and messes it up. I'm sure there's more to say about this as well, and I'm sure that if you study the historical roots of environmentalist philosophy, there's a lot of interesting things to be learned here, because the roots are basically in 19th century German and French Romanticism, which comes out of Rousseau, and it comes out of Hegel and others like them, and they were operating with a lot of these same kind of philosophic premises that I've been talking about already today.
Yeah. Well, we have another question here from Nixon. He asked, there seems to be a connection between the doctrine of original sin and the idea of white privilege as well. What are the practical consequences of holding these ideas and the motives of those who advance them? These ideas share the premises of the absolutely imperfection of man and self-sacrifice. Do you have any comment about this?
Again, not a lot, because I'm not an expert on the doctrine of white privilege, but I think I understand what Nixon is asking about. And in fact, Ayn Rand herself made a comment that was similar to this in an essay of hers called Moral Inflation, which I happened to note last night while I was preparing this. I'll just read for you a passage. This is from the Ayn Rand letter in April of 1974. She said, the ideologues of altruism, which is the morality of self-sacrifice, which we talked about, have miscalculated in regard to this country, and she's speaking of the United States. Materially, they have obtained more than they could hope to extort from any other poorer nation. Spiritually, they have failed. They mistook generosity for guilt. The guilt infection did not hold. Men who live on an earned income are not likely to accept an unearned guilt. Since the inflation of altruism has not breached the American people's basic self-esteem, the altruists are now trying to revive the grotesque anti-morality of original sin, i.e. of prenatal guilt, in a secular form. Having failed to induce personal guilt, they are struggling to induce racial guilt by proclaiming that people must suffer and pay for the alleged sins of their fathers. So I think it is true that if what you mean by white privilege, and white privilege is a very poorly defined concept, but if what that means is something like that there is guilt that white people have because of the sins of their ancestors, then yeah, that is similar to original sin in some important ways. Now, I don't think that's the only thing that anyone ever means by white privilege, and sometimes I think it means things that are more innocuous than guilt inherited from one's ancestors, and there's an interesting conversation we could have about that. But yeah, I think there's an element of that and what people mean by that.
Okay, thank you, Ben. There's a question from Steve, who asked, he says, Eve came to know good and evil by eating the fruit of the tree, which means she was ignorant of good and evil before the act. So how can she be a sinner?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that's one of the inconsistencies that is just inherent in this view. Yeah, how can you sin without knowing what it is that you're doing is right and wrong in the first place? And then how especially can the sin be getting that knowledge, right? If you'd think that if anything, you could only make a judgment of what someone is doing as right or wrong if they already know what's right or wrong, and then that getting knowledge of that is a good thing, if anything. Although even that doesn't make sense, because, well, it would only be good if there was something else you could do that's bad, but you didn't know it was good or bad yet. So it's a wacky conundrum.
Okay, I think the same. So we have a question from Ezequiel. He's asking, we need a rational morality, but rationality isn't an automatic process. Sorry for my pronunciation. To use it as a volitional action, that choice to use reason is in itself a rational choice, or it's a pre-reasoned choice? If so, do we have free will outside reason as much as we have it inside reason?
So this is often a kind of question that comes up when discussing Ayn Rand's view of free will.
Yeah.
And it's important to say maybe just a little bit more about what her view is and means first. So the way I put it originally was, it's the choice to think or not. It's the choice to turn your mind on or not. It's the choice to engage your mind to the task of understanding the world or not. And there are different degrees to which you can do that. And so what free will is the choice to engage reason. And I think part of what Ezekiel is asking is, well, given that you didn't have your reason engaged prior to making the choice, how is it a rational choice itself? And well, there's an important sense in which it's not, but that doesn't then mean that it's an irrational choice, because an irrational choice would be one that you make already knowing something is bad to do, and then you make it anyway. But if you haven't yet engaged your reason, then there's nothing that you've yet brought to bear that would tell you that your choice is wrong. And so the way that Ezekiel describes this actually, I think, is accurate and precise. He says it's he he puts it as a pre-reason choice, pre-rational choice. Yeah, it's a pre-rational choice, but it's the pre-rational choice which you have to make as a precondition for regarding anything as rational or irrational at all. And it's a choice that we all make early in the morning when we're getting up for the first time, and many subsequent times thereafter during the day.
Thank you, Ben. Herman is asking here, we could say that if a religious is in liberal politics, basically, with his belief he's limiting our free will thinking? Sounds like an opposite, be Catholic and have liberal thinking.
Well, there's something to what I think he's asking here, but I would say this, though. I mean, the mere fact that somebody has religious views, and let's suppose that one of them is a belief in original sin. So the mere fact that somebody, let's say, denies the existence of free will because they believe in this doctrine, that doesn't by itself take away our freedom. It just means that they don't believe that it exists. We're still free as long as they keep their beliefs in their head. Now, the reason I think he's asking this is because, well, a lot of them don't. A lot of them will act on their beliefs and implement policies which have the effect not of robbing us of our metaphysical free will. I mean, we have free will whether we're in chains or not. We have the ability to think or not, whether we're in prison or not. But what it means to violate someone's political freedom does mean to limit the efficacy of their what you call metaphysical freedom. I mean, you're certain choices you can't make to the extent that you're operating under force. And so your free will, your reason is negated. It's made impotent. You still have the capacity to make choices, but of course they're blocked. And yeah, there are a lot of ways in which religious philosophy leads to the use of force and to the abridgment of freedom, and therefore to the negation of the human mind. I mean, I mentioned the example that religious morality is opposed to abortion rights. That's a prime example of how the doctrine of original sin and practicing the doctrine of original sin leads to the abridgment of the freedom of women, which makes certain very important choices about their life impossible. There's many other such examples that we could go into, but someone has to actually practice their belief by enacting certain policies, of course, for that to affect anyone's freedom. Not everybody does.
Yeah, I think the topic of abortion is a very important one too. So I will invite you to do a webinar.
We could do a whole several hours just on that.
There will be a lot of fights for sure. Yeah. It will be fun too. So I have, I think we have time for, you have 10 more minutes for us?
Sure,
Fred?
sure.
Okay. So someone's asking here, I'm curious to your thoughts on the following anti-God religion argument. If God is all powerful, then can he create a stone which he could not lift? This shows a logical contradiction. What do you think of this type of argument in terms of effectiveness? And what do you think is the rationalization? They put a lot of difficult words here to pronounce. What do you think is the rationalization process a person would go through to say that the question doesn't make sense?
Yeah, I mean, this came up, I'm sure, because it's a similar kind of question to the one that I was asking about the how you can reconcile belief in free will with the idea that there's a God that's all powerful, all knowing, all good. And there's a similar kind of tension here. In fact, sometimes the way that I explain the tension between free will and God's alleged attributes is to say that if God could give us free will, it would be sort of like his ability to create a stone that even he couldn't lift. Because if he could give us free will, then he could give us the power to do a good thing, but he's the one who's supposed to have the power to do all good things. So it would be taking power away from him. And there are people who try to come up with rationalizations for that, who try to explain away the contradictions. and say, well, it's not really taking power away from him because it's power that he gave us. And likewise with the stone, there'll be people who offer rationalizations for why it's not really depriving God of his omnipotence to create that stone, because of course he's the one who created it. And all I can say at this point is, yeah, there's, with all of these kinds of theological dilemmas, there's always going to be dozens and dozens of theologians who have attempts to reconcile the contradictory statements. And the way they do it is by redefining one or another of the key concepts that seem to be in contradiction to each other. But what's important to notice about any such move is that it's always made for the sake of avoiding the contradiction. It's never grounded on any kind of independent reason for thinking that's the way the concept should really be defined. It's always, well, there's a higher sense in which it really is, you really are free, or there's a higher sense in which God really does have this power, even though it doesn't look like this. But it's always, what it is an example of the arbitrary. It's an example of what Ayn Rand called the arbitrary, where you are insulating your doctrine from the facts. You're insulating it from refutation by going through various linguistic exercises, but it's not in any way motivated by the evidence. And so, you know, when you get into arguments with people about these kinds of things, it's only worth going so far. Like, you can point out the initial pass at what the contradiction is and say, how can you have free will if God knows everything and is responsible for everything? And if they say, that's a good point, never thought of it that way, then maybe you've made some progress. But if they start redefining terms in order to wipe the contradiction away, there's not much point in having the conversation anymore, because there's nothing you're going to be able to say to show them that there's a contradiction. They're always going to be able to go make some other move that will insulate their claim from reality. That's in the nature of the arbitrary, and it's a choice that people have. It's part of their free will, is to look at reality or to evade it. And rationalization of doctrines using this kind of arbitrary redefinition is a key example of what it means to evade a fact.
Yeah. Ben, we have we have more questions, but I will choose two. One is fun. It's Santiago is asking, on Ayn Rand's view about original sin, would the snake be the real good one, the hero of the story? What do you think?
Well, if the idea is that it's the snake who's offering knowledge of good and evil, then yes.
Maybe Eve is the hero. Is the hero.
And there are places in Ayn Rand's writings where she'll say things like this. So in Rourke's speech, for instance, in The Fountainhead, she says, that man, the unsubmissive and first, stands in the opening chapter of every legend mankind has recorded about its beginning. Prometheus was chained to a rock and torn by vultures because he had stolen fire of the gods. Adam was condemned to suffer because he had eaten the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Whatever the legend, somewhere in the shadows of its memory, mankind knew that its glory began with one, and that one paid for his courage. So here, you know, the snake is helping Adam to be courageous. So yeah, if you want to speak metaphorically, she would have seen the snake as the good guy here, I guess. But she would have seen Eve as good too, for wanting to eat what he had to give him, and Adam is good for wanting to listen to what Eve said. Is the bad guy is God, who comes in and condemns him for it.
I agree. I like Eve very much, so I would not condemn her. So we have one more. Franco is asking, do you think the leaders of these original sin doctrines, both religious or secular, know all this and keep preaching it because they want power, or are they just irrational and or ignorant?
Well, this is a question that you can ask really about any evil doctrine, which is evil because it's irrational. And one of the things that I just touched on is that, in Ayn Rand's view at least, what evil is the refusal to see the facts. So your basic choice to look at the world or not, to think to engage your mind or not. And what virtue is making that choice. It's engaging your rationality. And vice is not engaging it, either through what she calls drift or through evasion, which means either just kind of letting your mind go or actively working to blot out reality in the way that it looks like certain of these theologians do when you're pointing out various contradictions in this doctrine. And so in one sense, they know what they're doing because they're the ones who are responsible for what they're doing. They're the ones who are engaging in evasion. They know the evasion that they made. But in another sense, well, what evasion is precisely blotting out by your own hand knowledge of what you're doing. And that's the purpose of many of all irrational philosophies is to rationalize things. It's to make someone feel better about themselves when they know they're doing the wrong thing. And I mean, original sin is a great example of this. It as I talked about, it allows people to rationalize evil by saying, well, you can't blame me, we're all sinners. And that way a person's, blotting out from their own vision the reality of their own sin, the reality of their own immorality. And I think the same kind of thing applies on a higher level when you're talking about formulating the doctrine of original sin or any other kind of irrational ideology. They will say, well, you can't expect me to have a perfectly logically consistent philosophy. After all, that would be intellectual pride if I tried to make everything consistent and resonant with the facts. So in a certain way, it's a kind of self-reinforcing doctrine. And you see that in the church today, invoking it to excuse the most horrific of crimes.
Yeah. Ben, I'm tempted to do one more because I have 3 people asking kind of the same. And I know you did talk about that before, but summarizing, do you think capitalism and Christianity can coexist in the long term?
Well, Ayn Rand didn't think that they could, and I basically agree with her. And it's related to some of the things that we've been discussing today. The best attempt I've ever seen to reconcile these two views is by the conservatives who say that original sin is actually a kind of argument for capitalism. And the way that they argue for that is to say, well, human beings are inherently depraved, but that includes government officials too. And so if you want to make sure that inherently depraved people aren't in charge of the world, you want to limit the power that government has. But 2 things. One is, you can't make a case for capitalism with that argument, because capitalism depends upon freedom of the mind and its freedom to pursue happiness and pursue self-interest. And you can't regard those things as good if you believe in original sin. And so there's nothing there worth protecting. So, at best, that kind of argument is a kind of motivation by fear argument. Be afraid of evil leaders and therefore take power away from them. But it's not actually an argument for any positive values that capitalism is there to protect. So that's one reason why I don't think that works. And the other is that it doesn't, most of history has, in most of history, original sin has been used to justify state power, because the people are inherently evil. And the people are the ones who run crazy in the streets and burn things down if you don't restrain them. And I think you see a kind of argument like this being given right now by Donald Trump in America. We got to, basically crack down on cities and send in the troops because these originally sinful people are running amok. And that's always been the default argument of tyrants. So you can try to make it cut both ways, as I think like public choice theorists sometimes do with leaders, but it still does cut both ways. And so it's really just going to depend on which group seems the most sinful at the time, leaders or the people. That's going to be what determines whether government has power or not, and that's not a long-term case for freedom.
Thank you very much, Ben. We are, yes, 15 minutes late, so thank you for your time. Thank you for this presentation. Do you have any advice for our audience, or can you recommend any treatment that is good?
Real quick, a few things that we talked about today. If you want to know more about Ayn Rand's view of original sin, best quick way to look it up is to go to the Ayn Rand lexicon on the aynrand.org website. Just type in original sin or use that link that I have on the screen, and I can even plug it into the chat in a second here.
Yeah, I can share that also on Facebook, on Ayn Rand Center Latin America, and our fan page.
And the other thing is, I mentioned Rand's view that religious sexual morality is a particularly good example of what it means to apply thinking about original sin to the topic of morality and how it undercuts people's self-esteem. Ayn Rand had a lot to say about that in her essay Of Living Death, which is also on our website. And just one last thing I'll mention, that if people want to learn more about, whoops, wrong button. Here we go. If people want to learn more about Ayn Rand generally, I definitely recommend downloading our app, the Ayn Rand University app. You can get this on the App Store or on Google Play. And if you want to learn more about her philosophy at a very deep level, the Objectivist Academic Center is accepting applications as we speak. It's a 3-year program. I'm one of the instructors, along with Ankar Gate, Aaron Smith, Keith Lockitch, Greg Salmieri. You can want to spend basically several hours a week taking classes over the course of your academic year. And Maria, you've been through the OSC, so you can tell people more about that.
I'm a graduate, and I would recommend this course because it's very, very, very inspiring. It was a before and after, so thank you for that. It was very
glad to have you. We're glad to have
everybody who wants to go deeper into philosophy and into objectivism is the time to register in OAC. And since before you go, I want to share with the people also. Let me share my. If I can't, I think Nixon doesn't let me to share my screen. I will try one more time. If not, I just wanted to let you know, to all of you, that next Tuesday, we will have Tara Smith for next webinar. Tara Smith is a professor of philosophy in University of Texas, and she's a member of the board of Ayn Rand Institute. She's an excellent speaker, and she will talk about justice in personal life. So we will have Tara next Tuesday, June 9th at 6 p.m. Argentinian time, and you will receive the information by email. And you can find out the information also on Facebook. So
that's a topic that Tara has a lot of great things to say about, I think.
Tara is great, and so don't miss her, because it's going to be a very entertaining 1-hour webinar. Ben, thank you very much again. It was a pleasure to have you, and I will invite you soon for talking about abortion.
Great.
And let's create a little bit of mess about it. Probably we can organize also debate about this topic. And well, as always, it's a pleasure to listen to you, and hopefully we will have you soon in Argentina. I don't know if this year, but maybe next year for our next Ayn Rand Con. So thank you very much.
I hope so. I very much enjoyed my last trip there, and I want to come back.
For sure. So gracias a todos por acompañarnos y nos vemos el martes que viene. Bye bye.
Bye bye.